This talk is going to be about a particular aspect of government policy, spending and taxes. Okay, we call that fiscal policy. That's kind of the topic that I spend a lot of my time working on. And there's going to be some polling in this. So you want to get out your device, laptop, and enter in that address there, pollev.com/Rauh. So while you're doing that, I'll just say a few more words about fiscal policy. I mean, fiscal policy, taxes and spending is not the only thing that government does, or the only ways that the government gets engaged in the economy. Some of the other ways that we'll hear about include monetary policy, which is the central bank and the way that the central bank controls the money supply or sets interest rates. I'm not going to have a lot to say about that today in my talk. We would need a whole other talk for that. And other ways that the government gets involved in the economy include regulation, and we're going to hear a lot about regulation today during the session from other speakers. We already talked about it last night. But for now, taxes and spending, fiscal policy, and that's the angle from which I'm going to approach the question. The title of the talk: how much government in a free market economy? Go into pollev.com/Rauh. You don't have to enter your name if you don't want to. You can enter an anonymous name, or you can put in Friedrich Hayek, or whatever you want. That was a joke. Okay. All right. And thanks. And now I'm gonna activate the first poll question. There's just a couple questions today. Wednesday I'll have some more, but the first question, which will pop up activated on your phone in a moment, is this. I want you to imagine 5 different countries out there in the world. And these countries each have a different level of government control of the economy. One of them has got 10% government control of the economy. Another has 25%, 33%, 50%, and 75%. And so what I want to ask you is, what is the largest level of government control where you would still say that the country is a free market economy? What's the largest level of government control where you would still say the country is a free market economy? And so I see a couple of you have been able to vote already. And this is not a fact question, right? You can, you could ask AI this question, but it would be asking ChatGPT for its opinion. Not very useful to be asking our AI overlords for their opinions at this point. For fact type questions, those chatbots are good. But just answer. I just want to know what you Don't search the internet or anything. Just what do you think? What would you still consider to be a free? Is it still a free market economy if the government controls 75% of the economy? Is it still a free market economy if they control 50%, 33%? What's the largest level that you would think of as being still a free market economy? Yeah.
How do we define control?
Okay, spending is a share of GDP. All right. So as I said, there are many ways the government can control the economy. We're focusing on taxes and spending today. So spending is a share of GDP. Okay, so please answer. I'm going to start at the bottom. So nobody said that 75% government spending as a share of GDP would be a free market economy. All right, but 20% of you said that 50% would be a free market economy. So that's about 5 of you. As for the next category, up 40% of you said 33%, which was kind of the modal. I mean, obviously, if there were a slider, you could have, if I update my technology, maybe you can get a slider, you could put exactly where you would put that limit to a free market economy. But the modal response here was 33% is sort of the maximum of these listed levels where you would still think of it as a free market economy. 24% of you said 25% would be the maximum level. And 16% said that 10% would be the maximum level for a free market economy. All right, so that's just some level setting there. So let's look at, maybe some of you have already been doing this or looking this up, but let's now look at some facts from some select countries. All right, so I've started out with 2 countries here that are very familiar to me and to you. So that means that one of them is Israel, and the other is the United States. All right, and this shows the level of government spending as a share of GDP. So for all economics majors know exactly what GDP is. If you're not an economics major, you don't know what GDP is maybe, but you can think of GDP as the total value of all goods and services produced in a country in a given year. And so when you think about government expenditures as share of GDP, that's kind of a measure of the government's involvement in the economy, or the share of the economy that the government is spending. Of course, they have to get those resources from somewhere. So they're taxing people to get those resources, or they're borrowing money to get those resources, or they're printing money to get those resources. Okay, so I haven't yet revealed which is Israel, which is the United States, but the top country in the mid-1990s started out as being above 50% of GDP, so that's kind of maybe above the level where most of you would have said it's still a free market economy. And as of 2023 was below 40%, but not much below 40%, so still kind of a level where many of you might have said that's not a free market economy. And the green line there at the bottom started at 35% in the mid-1990s, had a big upturn there in 2007, 8, 9, going above 40%, coming back down in 2013, 15, 19, back to around 35%, spiking up then to 45% in 2020, and then coming back down to about 36%. Never coming, bottom line is showing these spikes. They kind of go up and then they come back down, but they don't ever quite come back down to where they were before. So which is Israel and which is the United States?
The top one is Israel.
Yes. Okay, good. So top one is Israel and the bottom one is the United States. And what I'm trying to show you here, as you might imagine, based on sort of my framing of all of this, is for a lot of people, except maybe econ people who study this stuff a lot, it's actually kind of, first of all, just the levels of government spending in these countries are actually kind of surprising, particularly in the United States. And United States, I mean, the sort of baseline level in the 90s went down below 35%. U.S. government was cutting a fair amount of spending due to what was called the peace dividend, kind of the end of the Cold War and less military spending. And it sort of drifted back up. And then during 7, 8, 9, there was a financial crisis. And there was a big increase in government expenditures in the United States during that financial crisis, up to over 40% of GDP spent by the government. Drifted slowly back down to around 35%, not back to the level of the 1990s, and then spiked up during COVID to 45%. All right, so that was U.S. Government spending as a share of GDP. Israel, you know the story better than I do, but Israel used to have much larger levels of government spending, and these have come down over time. I haven't studied Israel during the financial crisis, but it was interesting reviewing this during the last week to recall that Israel did not have a big spike in government expenditures during the global financial crisis of 7, 8, 9, which is sort of ancient history for you all. You were born. Most of you were born at that time, 2007, 8, 9, right? But for me, I was already a professor at the time, so it was a little more of a sentient being. And then both Israel and the United States had a big spike during COVID and came back down. And of course, Israel in 2023 having increased military expenditures. All right, so that's the United States and Israel. Well, let's look at a few other countries. All right, so I'm just going to add a bunch of other lines to this graph. I've added 4 more lines to the graph, and just to show some representative other countries. These countries that I've added to the graph, these are all 3 of them are G7 countries, other G7 countries, and one of them is not a G7 country, but is a very wealthy Western country. All right, so interesting to sort of think about these different paths and trajectories of what countries these might be. All right, so the red one at the top is showing government spending of 55% in the mid-90s, drifting up to close to 60%, over 60% during COVID, and coming back down to around 57%. Okay, that's the top one, so that's one that I've added. We can also look at the bottom one, which is floating around at around 35%, comes down to around a third. That was that kind of pivotal level where many of you were saying that's kind of the maximum, where I still think of this as a free market economy, spiking up during COVID to some extent, but then coming back down again. And then I've added these 2 countries in the middle here, this one in the light green at 55%, and instead, in contrast to the one in the red, sort of went down to some extent, and then this sort of maroon-colored one bouncing around here. Anybody want to take a guess at what the top one is? I said 3 of the 4 are G7 countries, and the other 4, the fourth one is a very wealthy Western country. Okay, so the top one is indeed France. That is correct. All right, so the top one is France. So France regularly is spending more than half of GDP. More than half of activity in the economy is coming from government spending, which of course, when we say coming from government spending, you got to keep in mind that the government has to get its resources from somewhere. A lot of times you ask people on the street, who should provide schooling or who should provide education? Well, they may say that, well, the government should do it. Okay, well, if that's fine, maybe they mean the government should organize it, but the money's got to come from somewhere, right? So the money has to come either from taxing someone or from borrowing money from someone that you're going to repay in the future, or from printing money. So France is the top one. All right, how about the bottom one? Anybody want to guess on the bottom one? Switzerland is correct. All right, very good. All right, so Switzerland is correct. Switzerland below the United States. This is actually remarkable to a lot of people who study economics, come from the United States and travel to Switzerland, because it actually feels like the sort of things you might depend on government to do, like infrastructure, are really good there. And yet they're only spending a third of GDP. Government is only spending a third of GDP. By the way, one point I wanted to make, actually talking about both Switzerland and the U.S., is this isn't as much of a important point for Israel, but it's something to keep in mind when you do compare international statistics, is these are all levels of government combined. So for the United States, we have the federal government, we have state governments, and then we have the local governments like cities and counties. And in the U.S., it's about 2/3 of spending is federal government spending. About 1/3 is state and local government spending. Our state and local governments in the United States do a lot of stuff. They do a lot of public safety, they provide a lot of the education, things like that. And so for Switzerland, it's the cantons as well as the federal government. Switzerland is the other way around. The federal government's only about 1/3 of spending in Switzerland. 2/3 are from the local governments. All right, so I'll reveal what the other ones are as well. Yeah, okay, so let me do the reveal, and then we'll do some questions, and we do some questions, right? So you can see top one is France, bottom one is Switzerland. The two in the middle that we didn't talk about are Germany and the UK. So Germany starting at the same level as France in the mid-1990s, but actually somewhat decreasing as a government expenditure share of the economy. I say somewhat because you got to keep this y-axis in mind here. These are all levels that are pretty high in that distribution of options that I gave you in the poll, right? So something to keep in mind, that government is doing a lot more, spending a lot more of the economy's resources that they're getting from tax and economic activity than you might have thought. All right, so let's take some questions here. So yeah, you here and then here, yeah.
So are there any countries that the degree of intervention by the government is even higher or lower than Switzerland? In France? Like this Europe,
Yes.
or this is the world?
No, these are just select countries. So these are just select countries. There absolutely are countries where the degree is higher or lower, and so we could put those on there. There are also some issues with measurement. So for example, a country like China, on the same kind of statistical basis as this, China often comes out as only having the same degree of government expenditures as the U.S. practically, but I mean, in China the government controls a lot more. So there definitely are countries that are going to be higher or lower.
What would be the top highest and the top lowest?
Good question. The highest might be a country like North Korea. All right, and the lowest, you're going to see countries. I think Chile is lower than Switzerland, but you're also going to have countries like the Cayman Islands, that are way down there, that are basically kind of tax haven type of places. But this is not a bad set. This is kind of not a bad range to anchor yourself around, despite some of those outliers. Yeah, I was like you and then you. Yeah.
Really depend how you counting the government spend, because if I remember, maybe I'm wrong, but I think in France, the pension is by the government.
Yeah, very good.
So
Very
it's
good.
very high, but in other countries, everybody has a pension. If in Israel you take the pension and put it in the government, it don't even change everything very much. Just the manager is, some governmental person. It's the same money. You just put it from here and here, and also in Israel there is now after the war, there's something called Master Push. They build again the building, they don't count it as government expense, even if it's government expense or whatever. It just really depends how we count it.
Well, you're right. There are major questions about how to do the accounting. This OECD is the source, and they think very hard about trying to make apples to apples comparisons. The pensions is a big one. I would argue there's actually a huge difference between the government running a pension system and the private sector running a pension system, because I think a great example is, in the U.S. So though if it is governmental, it's counted in these stats. U.S. we have this program called Social Security, which is pitched to the public as being this kind of closed system where only money that goes into Social Security can get used for Social Security, and conversely, the only money that can be used for Social Security is dedicated Social Security money. But that program is running out of resources, and it's pretty clear that what's most likely going to happen, even though it's going to require an act of Congress, what's most likely going to happen is they're just going to take resources from the general budget and use it to pay for the pension. So I think the fact that those lines are really blurred when the government provides the pension, to me, makes it valid to include the pensions in the government expenditures when the government's doing it and not when the private sector is doing it. But your point in general about accounting is good. OECD works hard to try to make apples to apples comparisons, and it's never perfect. It's a very good point. Yeah.
How much government involvement was in the United States in the 19th century?
Okay, so if we're going to measure spending as a share of it's going to be 10% or lower. The maximum, other than, I think during the Civil War, right, you had, something like a time like that, you're going to have big spikes in this. But in Free to Choose, the book by Milton Friedman, which is a great book if you're interested in free market economics, Free to Choose, yeah, in Free to Choose, he makes the statement that during all of U.S. history, up through World War I, that except for major wars, it never went above 12%. So that's my source for that one. All right, so great questions, and always difficult dealing with government statistics to get apples to apples comparisons, but I think it's useful range to sort of level set. And what happens when we now look at if we look at the change in GDP per capita over a roughly comparable period? So GDP per capita, so again, GDP for non-econ majors, GDP is the percent, or GDP is the total value of all goods and services produced in an economy in the year. If you divide that by the number of people in the economy, you get a pretty decent estimate of sort of average income per person or average economic production per person. And what do we see here? We see a pattern that we get as well if we were going to do a scatter plot with more countries, but just to illustrate it with these, right, that since 1990, we've just kind of baselined these all around the 1990 level. If I were just to show you the dollar amounts, right, they're starting from different dollar amounts and ending at different dollar amounts. But what we see here is that from 1990 through to the present, the top performers in terms of growth, GDP per capita is often when economists say, what are we talking about growth? They're usually talking about GDP growth or GDP per capita growth. So if you study economic growth, some of you are doing graduate degrees in economics, the Robert Barrow textbook, you're starting out, you're talking about growth, and there are the per capita equations and there are the level equations. Per capita is a good way of just thinking about how living standards kind of overall improved, and these are also adjusted for differences in living costs between countries. But what you see here is Switzerland and Germany up above 80% increase in GDP per capita since 1990. Next comes Israel, okay, very close behind, very, very good. Next is the United States, not bad. UK and France lower. So this is a pattern that you're going to see a lot, which is that if you plot countries based on kind of government involvement in the economy and you compare it with growth, the countries where there was less government involvement in the economy or decrease in government in the economy saw the most growth in GDP per capita. So this kind of order would line up with the order that I showed you on the previous slide, with I guess one exception, Germany. Well, what happened in Germany? Why did Germany have such big economic growth? What happened? That happened. The European Union was founded. That would probably have affected, should have helped France as well. Maybe it did help France, and France would have been even worse if they hadn't. I don't know. But what else happened in Germany around 1990? The Berlin Wall fell, and so half of the country that had been living under basically total government control became a free market economy. And so you got a lot of growth from that in over the 90s and the early part of the 2000s that increased GDP per capita by a lot in Germany. That's why you see this, the red line kind of outpacing the other ones in the 1990s. So this is a pretty common pattern that you see, right? So the more government involved in the economy you're going to get less growth. Now, one kind of questions that should be floating around in your mind are, okay, but then maybe government involvement in the economy or government spending comes at the cost of growth, but surely this government spending has got some other benefits that might be valuable, right? So I'm playing devil's advocate with the statistics I showed you, right? So how should you think about this? I'm definitely making the case to you that less government spending is going to lead to more growth and more prosperity overall. That's what I believe. But maybe the government is doing important things. Presumably, governments are doing important things, and I wouldn't contend that nothing that the government does is important. So let's just drill down for the U.S. and Israel briefly. Just look at what are some of the things that they do. So this is again using OECD data. Amazing the data you can just get out there, right? I mean, you want to explore any of this data anymore, you can just go to the OECD Data Explorer. You can pull down all this, any country you want, or you can ask ChatGPT to do it, or your favorite AI overlord, and they'll do it. It's great. So what are these governments spending money on? This is interesting. Remember, U.S. and Israel both in recent period ended with pretty similar levels of government spending as a share of GDP, right? So 39% for Israel, 36% for the U.S. Before the war began in 2023, they were really pretty much at the same level. So 36%, 39% of the economy. So what's the government spending money on? Well, this is a bar chart. I've ordered these in descending order for the U.S. So one thing that often surprises people is that the number one thing that the U.S. government spends money on is health care, health insurance, health services. I could have polled you, sometimes I do polls where I poll people on factual things and I say, no, see, this is not what it really was. But I actually prefer to just poll you on what your opinions are about things and then show you the facts. But so health spending, about 26% of U.S. general government spending. Governments are federal, state, and local level in the U.S. are spending around $32,000 per person in the United States. And around 26% of that is on our health programs. So you often hear about the United States, this place where there are a lot of people who are uninsured, don't have health insurance, etc. It is true that there are some tens of millions of people in the United States who do not have health insurance. But what's also true is that there are programs for both the elderly and the poor, where the definition of poor for that program that covers the poor has expanded to much higher levels of income, so that actually a lot of the people who don't have health insurance in the United States at this point, I would have to tell you, are voluntarily choosing not to buy health insurance, because in the US, it's not mandatory to have health insurance. And if you are earning up to 3 times the poverty level in the United States, you're going to be eligible for the government program called Medicaid. So it sounds like people who say this, that those who are uninsured in the United States are voluntarily uninsured, often get criticized for having some kind of cruel or heartless view of things. But the fact is that if you earn up to 3 times the poverty level in the United States, you are eligible for a government insurance program. And if you don't take that government insurance program, then the question is, why not? So, so health expenditures, around 26% of government expenditures in the U.S. are going to healthcare. We have social protection, general public services. I'm going to talk about that. I'm going to leave that one as a little bit of a mystery until the end of the talk. I like to have a little mystery going on, what that might be. It's a lot of things lumped together, but it's interesting that the U.S. has got 17.6% general public services, Israel only 11.8%. Okay, education, 13.8% U.S., Israel 16%. So what are some key differences? Well, clearly, Israel's spending a lot more on defense by necessity. United States only spending 8% of its budget, federal, state, and local government expenditures on defense, and somewhat similar in other categories. Social protection includes a lot of programs like welfare programs. In the United States, we have a temporary aid for needy families program. We have a food program for the poor called SNAP, or used to be known as food stamps. We have housing vouchers. So actually, when I present this, a lot of people are surprised at just the extent of U.S. government expenditures and of social support. And I'll also say that I'll come back to this, but this number is very understated because a lot of our social protection actually comes through the tax code. There's something called the Earned Income Tax Credit in the United States, where essentially if you work a little bit and you're not earning a lot of money, you can file a tax return and actually get money back from the government. You don't pay taxes, you get negative income tax. And there are a lot of people who get those checks from the government. And I have some stories that I can tell about that actually at some later time. Just going back to the healthcare point, this is another thing that surprised a lot of people. If you look at the per capita healthcare spending across countries, and these are the same countries I showed before. I guess I put Canada in here because a lot of United States people are interested in Canada as having Canada and the UK have national health service programs, socialized medicine. United States government or compulsory, where compulsory includes things like mandating that employers provide health insurance for their employees, is spending $12,000 per person in the United States on health care. And you compare that to other countries, significantly lower in other countries. And there's a mix of a lot of stories going on here. I don't know, are people pretty happy in Israel with the health insurance program here? Seems like people are generally very happy based on my experience talking to people. And you're doing it at a pretty low level of PPP adjusted dollars per capita, which is quite impressive. I'll come to you in just a second. Just one more comment about that. Countries like the United States and Canada, people are not generally happy with those public medical programs. Very, very long waits for procedures or even an appointment at a doctor's office. They're spending significantly more per capita than you are. United States is spending massively more per capita than you are. And a lot of that is government spending. A lot of that is because the government is just basically reimbursing private providers for essentially whatever services those private providers want to pay. They're supposed to be trying to keep costs down a little bit. But this is a whole topic that could be a lecture on its own, but I did want to talk about it. So, yeah, question over here. Yeah. Yeah.
Talk about it.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
So, a lot of people that, I guess you are, very big strong supporter of free market. In Israel, the health region market is not free. And it's free to some extent, but not so much. And a lot of doctors say that because of that, it saves a lot of expenditure. Because you don't need to take a lot of unnecessarily checks and risks. You don't need to use tons of MRIs and whatever for one person. Because you basically decide what's good for him. So that's why the expenditure is very low and the healthcare is kind of good. So isn't that a very strong argument against free markets? Because people don't necessarily know what's good for them. And the healthcare here in Israel is great, even though people don't necessarily really choose.
Well, it's interesting because I think in the U.S., part of the problem is, the government is saying, we'll reimburse, this is a simplification, we'll reimburse whatever the doctor says you need. And the doctor says you need these 10 complicated things, and the government pays for it. So we don't have a free market. I think that's kind of my point. In the United States, we don't have a free market health system. We have a system where the government is basically agreeing to reimburse whatever doctors kind of want to do, and that's not free market. That's sort of a version of socialized spending where the doctors decide what money gets spent on.
In Israel?
Well, yeah.
So the platform are exactly free market model. They work on the voucher system,
Yeah.
like meal to treatment, which means that each platform receives money according to the person that decides to give it to them through the vouchers. So you have competition between the platform, making them much better because they're competing with each other. Different to the hospitals where you are, that is free market.
Well, there you have an answer from people who understand the Israel system much better than I do. Yeah.
The biggest major difference between the U.S. is that the incentive system is much different. So you can see doctors making $1 million, $2 million, $3 million a year in America, if they're a specialty doctor or whatever. In Israel, the salaries are so much shorter. So you see people who decide to go into medicine here, not necessarily do it for profit, because it's not as an amazing financial decision to make. Where in the U.S., you know that if you go into medicine, and I'm not saying people have one specific thing where they're like just greedy and looking for money, but the incentive system is much more like to become wealthy. Right? You become very, very financially wealthy from getting into that. Here in Israel, the salaries are much lower.
I do think, I imagine there are probably people who, from around the world who go to the United States for specialized procedures. Because in the United States, you do, in part because of this competition and this idea that you can't, if you're the very best doctor at doing any one given special thing, you can make a lot of money in the United States at doing that thing. And so what we have is this kind of strange hybrid system where you have you have people who are basically taking fully private money to do very, very specialized procedures where they're the best in the world. And then you have a lot of reimbursement of all kinds of things that doctors want to do that's getting paid for by the government without real competition. And so we have this kind of hybrid system that I think has, if you really need a procedure and you have money in the United States, or you have a great health insurance plan, then the U.S. is absolutely a terrific place to be. Also, though, there are not a lot of people in the United States who are going without health care that they need. Yeah. Okay, so voluntary. These are things like the premiums that that individuals pay for their health insurance.
By the way, Judge, there's a parallel project.
The parallel private. Yeah.
You can how so your government property not pay that includes food.
Medicare, Medicaid, and employer contributions that are mandated by the government. And so yeah, because they're and the OECD goes and tries to disentangle this under the Obamacare ACA. There is an employer mandate. So it just tries to disentangle voluntary individual spending per year from government plus employer. All right, so how big should government be? So now that we've done some facts, I want to outline and sort of critically assess a few, was there a question? Or a few motivations for government spending, all right? So I'm going to go through a few of them. There are 5 that I have, but one of them gets a whole lecture on its own, which is the last one, which is redressing inequality through redistribution, because that's a very hot topic, very important topic. A lot of people are of the belief that the main role of government is just to address inequality, right? Basically redistribute money to address inequality. So I have we're going to leave that until Wednesday. So a few motivations for government spending I'm going to go through. First one is, I think, the most classic one, the most sort of Enlightenment values driven one, which is protection of private property and enforcement of contracts. Very basic stuff. Second is the social safety net and poverty alleviation. So I think of that as distinct from redressing inequality through redistribution, the last one, the last one is, okay, somebody makes $1 million a year, somebody else only makes $40,000 a year. The government is just going to tax the person who makes $1 million a year and literally give the money through goods and services to the person making $40,000 a year. Social safety net and poverty alleviation is more, is $40,000 a year enough for somebody to, be viewed as able to, able to feed themselves, able to have shelter, things like that, providing a social safety net. Providing public goods where there are market failures, this is sort of the most drawn on motivation for certain types of government spending on a lot of things like education, healthcare, infrastructure, things like that. Market failure, the idea that the market can't provide it. Smoothing over economic shocks. A lot of those big spikes in spending that we saw in those graphs during the financial crisis and during COVID were done in the name of smoothing over economic shocks. So I want to go through each of these and see, do a brief critical assessment of each one of them. So first one being rule of law, protection of private property, enforcement of private contracts. Brief tour through sort of political philosophy and the philosophy, very brief, extremely brief, political philosophy and the philosophy of government. So 1651, John Hobbes wrote this book, famous treatise called The Leviathan, where he said there's no place for industry because the fruit thereof is uncertain in the so-called state of nature unless you have a very strong ruler. And this is some old painting of this Leviathan, this very strong ruler that was going to come in and make sure that people didn't just expropriate each other. So in Hobbes' state of nature, you had just people going around and expropriating each other, and you needed a very strong government strong figure to keep that under control. Then came John Locke, who said government can be limited to just doing a few things, protecting natural rights, life, liberty, and property. Okay, in the United States, Thomas Jefferson twisted that around to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I guess he thought that sounded better than life, liberty, and property, but really it's life, liberty, and property. Those are the Lockean ideas. So the role of government under John Locke is to protect natural rights, which he enumerated as life, liberty, and property. So I guess first observation is we've gotten pretty far away from just these things. Governments are doing a lot of stuff, right? A lot of those things, providing healthcare, providing education. Maybe you think of maybe you think of those as natural rights in some more modern definition of natural rights based on your own preference. But Locke's answer was actually it's pretty limited, just protecting life, liberty, and property. So what does the protection of life, liberty, and property require the government in sort of today's economy to be doing if we're just focused on those things? And an economist who I mentioned last night at dinner had an answer for that. All right, I guess not, maybe only economists draw a line from Hobbes, Locke to Ron Coase, but that's fine. I'm going to do it. I do it. And Coase had this idea of the problem of social cost. So until Coase came along, the argument about protecting life, liberty, and property was, well, if the government needs to protect people's life, liberty, and property, then what we need is a lot of regulation to do it. We need a heavy-handed government that's gonna come in and basically say, yeah, all right, if you're doing something that is disruptive to me or has negative externalities, then we need a specific regulation to try to address that. And this came up in the AI talk last night. The idea being that the AI example, we have this new technology. It could be dangerous. Government needs to come in and regulate it. And Coase had a different answer for what you do when one agent imposes negative externalities on someone else. He was thinking about things like noise or pollution. The old solution was that you need to pass laws to protect those who are suffering from these negative externalities. Coase's solution was that the government's role is just to make it legally clear and enforceable who has what rights. Then the parties will bargain to an efficient solution. So last night, when we were talking about AI regulation, the question that I asked was, well, when is the legal system that we have in Israel or in the United States, when is that sufficient for the parties to deal with this on their own? We brought up a bunch of examples came up of things like AI medical robots that might run amok, or AI algorithms to do hiring that would become racist or something. Those under our current legal system, those entities are doing things that are illegal. If it were people doing it, they would be sued. If there are people managing or running these algorithms or owning them, they're going to be sued. And as long as it's clear that there's a right, and this was the speaker's answer, which was I think a good answer. The question is, well, who, is it clear where the liability is, whose right it is to sue? Will the courts fairly decide these things? That's a good question. But to the extent that it is clear, then we don't really need that much heavy regulation. You're going to have very quickly, you're going to have the legal system coming in, and you're going to have lawsuits, you're going to have criminal prosecutions that would then obviate the need for a lot of regulation and regulatory codes that get very long. One stat I didn't put in here is in the United States, the federal regulatory code is hundreds of thousands of pages long. Hundreds of thousands of pages long. So the government is really trying to go in there and it's like threading a million needles. I mean, they're trying to figure out, we write this rule and write that rule and that rule and that rule. And Kosa's point was, look, it's a fool's errand to try to do that. The power lies in just making sure that property rights are protected, and then agents can take action to protect themselves. Yeah.
One could argue, though, that, for example, in the 2008 financial crisis, looking back at it, nobody would prosecute for a lot of criminal activity that maybe occurred leading up to it. So just the threat of prosecution doesn't always necessarily help align people's incentives with the public good. So you sometimes have like market failures.
Well, even worse was the fact that the government bailed out all of these banks. And I think also that, as you said, right, they were engaging in illegal activity. Would it have helped if there had been more regulations? Well, apparently not. I mean, they were just violating all the rules anyway. So to me, I think the big kind of problem with the financial crisis was the fact that, and this also happened during COVID, although it was maybe in the financial crisis there are more clear kind of heroes and villains. But like in the financial crisis, I mean, the government bailed out all of these financial institutions, and what that meant is that shareholders, in fact, they bailed out a lot of wealthy investors in the financial crisis and during COVID. And they bailed out a lot of executives who really should have lost everything, but somehow managed to come back and keep making money through their financial institutions. So that, to me, the problem with the financial crisis is revealed the fact that we also have kind of like a socialized finance system in the United States. And maybe around the world, and maybe not in Israel. I don't know what was going on in Israel during the financial crisis. I haven't studied it, but in the United States, we socialized a lot of the losses from the financial crisis. We socialized a lot of the losses during COVID as well. We bailed out very, very wealthy investors. It seems like during COVID, you might think, oh, well, that was just an exogenous thing. Some virus came out, nobody could have predicted it, and so on. Yeah, but that's why investors are supposed to get rewarded for taking risk. People voluntarily took risks. They voluntarily bought stocks. They voluntarily bought bonds. So So anyway, I take your point. I think the biggest problem is that we actually implicitly backstop the financial sector in the U.S., which is itself a form of socialization that I think has been harmful. Yeah.
I would like to ask, how can government make it legally clear how it is sentence? Government is to make it clear
and enforceable.
Was what right in terms of, let's say, global warming, or too much fishing in the sea, or in areas that nothing is belong to a defined country. Like global warming, it's complicated to say that this part is belong to China, this to the US. How can you solve the issue? How it is a kind of solution?
Well, let me give you one environmental example, and then I'll come back and try to link it to global warming and carbon dioxide, because that's complicated. But here's just an environmental example. All right, so Wind turbine built loud turbines near residents in a rural area of the U.S. state of Oregon. Oregon law gives residents the right to peace and quiet. So they have a law in the book saying residents have a right to peace and quiet. What happened? So the old solution would have been, well, we need to go and tell the turbine company they can't do this. And this is the New York Times headline, "Turbines too loud, here, take $5,000. All right, so what happened was the wind turbine company offered to pay residents to deal with the noise in exchange for signing a waiver promising they won't complain to the authorities.
But again, this
So-
is a defined area.
Yeah.
This is different from global warming, which who will you give money? Like China will give me money for the global
Well,
warming.
we do have something called the social cost of carbon, and the United States government, obviously, it depends on who's in power in the U.S. what that number is, because that number has been floating around a lot. Is it $5 per ton? Is it $50 per ton? But that number anchors you around some cost, and so this is exactly the motivation for things like carbon trading schemes or a carbon tax. Exactly the motivation for that. So I think carbon tax is probably heavier handed than COS, but carbon trading schemes are very, that's exactly what it is. It says, okay, here, this is the cost. We're going to distribute some property rights by giving some initial endowment of this right to pollute with carbon. You can buy and sell those in these markets. So I think that the carbon trading schemes is exactly the way that that's been implemented, and that those exist in Canada and California. So those schemes do exist. Now, how they're implemented is going to depend a lot, as I mentioned, on what is that social cost of carbon going to be? What is that defined as? And of course, different governments are saying different things about what that cost actually is. All right, so that's just a couple more quick examples of what happens when confidence in markets and property rights is lost. Venezuela is a good example. Left-wing populist Maduro was elected in 2013, known as the son of Chavez. Chavez was a sort of socialist, quasi-dictatorial socialist, and Maduro was the next level of that. What you had was literally, seizures of stores, right, of retail chains. You had nationalization of things like the oil industry. This shows a before and after picture of a storekeeper. What his store looked like before, what his store looked like after. That's at the kind of retail level. If you look at the economic macroeconomic level, this led to massive declines in real GDP. Also a big spike in inflation, which was related to his use of monetary policy or printing money to do things that the government wanted to do, that he wanted to do. So I think there was a question back here. Sorry, I missed your hand. Did you have your hand up? Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, but it was about.
Oh, it was about COS? Yeah.
I want to talk about this issue for a second and give maybe an alternate perspective. I don't think that everything is monetary incentive. You take probably, some old citizen, and you put it against the capitalist monster. I'm sorry for defining that way. And
I'm sorry, who against the capitalist monster?
the citizen that is living in the house.
Yeah.
And he probably gonna go to a random lawyer and ask him, what can I do? I cannot live in my house right now in a peaceful way. And the lawyer is gonna tell him, in the best case scenario, you can get some kind of involvement for what's happening. Now, I don't remember the name of the COS hearing. Everything is okay. We solved the issue. But in reality, we have a problem here, because there is really big, uneven forces that works one against another. And we both know who's going to win and how he's going to win it. So for me, looking only at the monetary perspective is a problem.
I don't think you know who's going to win. In this state, the law gives the residents the right to peace and quiet. The law specifies property rights. So the wind company very well might have lost against the residents where it says you have the right to peace and quiet. So all negotiations
always get done under the shadow of the law, and what's going to get determined under a settlement. And I think what you're giving is a to me, your argument says, okay, it's important. I think your argument enforces the Coast point that it's important for the law to specify the property rights. So as long as it's clear that the residents have the right to peace and quiet, then the system works.
How is the solution worse in this case?
Pardon me? How is it?
The citizen is going to sit in his house and it's going to be noisy.
Yeah.
But he's going to get $5,000 a month per week.
Right.
So we have a solution, and everything works. But in reality, it's not the case. You're probably going to be irritated, and his life wouldn't be the same as before. But the wind shuffle is going to shuffle with it. There's no problem.
So this was my understanding is this was done on a
household by household basis, and not everybody had to take the 5,000, and some may be held out. I mean, this also happens when the government wants to try to seize property for infrastructure projects. They try to buy people off, and often there are holdouts. So nobody was forced to sign it.
So the agreement was done before they built the turbine, or after?
Before.
Okay.
Yeah.
I probably missed that.
So yeah. So I mean, it's.
And I still think it's a bit off. But
Okay. Well, I guess I still think that as long as the law specifies where the property rights are, that these things work pretty well. If the law, if the law didn't give them the right to peace and quiet, I would sort of agree with you, because then they could just go and do what the company could sort of do what they wanted to and say, yeah, here's some change. Okay, next thing, social safety net. All right, so I mentioned we saw the social protection spending is large in the U.S. And in Israel as a share of government spending. U.S. safety net is even bigger than that, because I mentioned a lot of that safety net is tied to work and is received either if you work. So for example, SNAP is our food program for people who can't afford food. The earned income tax credit is that negative income tax, EITC. Child tax credit. There's a lot of welfare spending in the U.S. that happens through the tax code. I have to tell one story, because one thing I hear a lot when I say that is people tell me, oh, well, are you really saying that people who live in urban poverty are capable of obtaining these benefits? I've heard people say that to me as like an argument for why actually we don't really have a safety net. And I always found that argument really annoying. And the reason is that at the University of Chicago, there is a neighborhood not far from the University of Chicago where if you take the elevated train instead of taking the metro along the shore, you walk through some neighborhoods. They're some of the lowest income neighborhoods in the United States. And what you see is, if you walk through those neighborhoods, you see a lot of multiple tax preparer outlets there. So you literally will see, it's like a convenience store and a tax preparer outlet when you get off the Green Line stop at 55th and Garfield, which you probably shouldn't do at night, but still, right? That's what you see there. And actually, if you pull up a map of the South Side of Chicago, which is where one of the places in the Midwest where urban poverty is concentrated, it is dotted with many shops that are tax preparer shops, and what those shops are doing is they are assisting people in applying for these benefits, such as the earned income tax credit, right? So ensuring that you can get these. So it's now that's not a defense of doing the system that way, but that's just to point out that there is a large social safety net that happens through our tax code that's actually being distributed by. Essentially being distributed by these companies like H&R Block and these tax preparers in urban areas. So poverty alleviation is an important goal, but incentives are a big issue. People consider their marginal tax rate in deciding whether to work or work more. So this is from an example from some congressional testimony by some folks at the Illinois Policy Institute. So think about this example. You have a single mother of two in the U.S. state of Illinois who's making $12 per hour or only $22,000 per year. And her employer decides to offer her a promotion and a pay raise to $18 per hour or $33,000 in net pay. So the example asks, would it be wise under the current system in the U.S. for the single mother to accept the promotion? And so your first thought might be, well, why would it not be wise to accept a 50% promotion? So $18 per hour is still not that much, but it's better than earning $12 per hour, so why not? Well, the problem is that if the employee accepts that raise, then they're going to lose a tremendous amount of benefits. So this graph shows the blue is the salary component, so that $12 per hour is $22,000 per year on the left, 18 per hour is $33,000 per year on the right. There are a lot of government benefits, temporary aid for needy families, SNAP, the food stamps, other things, other tax-based welfare programs begin to phase out. Women, infants, and children. There are many, many anti-poverty programs that are going to phase out very dramatically as you gain that income, and so that tends to disincentivize lower-income people from building human capital and increasing their earnings. Actually, this person ends up being overall worse off because of the amount of benefits that they lose, and this is a major problem when thinking about constructing social welfare programs. What's one? You've probably thought about this. What's one alternative that one could do to avoid this? Yep.
My question is, if I'm earning $50 per hour,
Yeah.
and then then they ask me if I want to get a raise of it and earn now $75.
Yeah.
If I will lose the same amount of taxes and all the benefits that I'm having now, because if I'm not, it's actually keeping us, like the poor is going to be poor,
Yeah.
they're not going to get the raise,
Right.
and the rich ones will get raised and can have more money.
Yeah.
So
I agree.
the tax system is going in this situation. It's not helping us to reduce the inequality.
I agree. That's exactly. I completely agree. It's not helping to reduce inequality because it keeps the person earning $12 an hour thinking it's fine if I earn $12 an hour.
Yeah. That, you made the point better than I could. Yeah.
What's the share of these kind of people in the U.S. Society? How many people are in this situation of this incentive?
Well, the median income per year in the United States is around $65,000 per person. So here we're looking at people who are probably around the 20th percentile.
Yeah, but not every one of them with 2 children and a single mother. Not everyone has this benefit.
Correct. Correct.
It's very specific group.
Okay.
Yeah. That's true.
That's true. A specific group to make a stark point. Absolutely. Yeah, less money, but less money, exactly. So my question to you was, okay, what kind of anti-poverty program or welfare program could be designed that would avoid some of these problems? There's one that's been talked about a lot lately in many countries of the world. The universal basic income, right? So the idea behind a universal basic income is we're not going to constantly means test or look at whether an individual qualifies for a certain benefit based on their employment status or based on applying for each of these different benefit programs. Everybody's just going to basically get a flat amount, and that flat amount is some money that they can use as anti-poverty. So Milton Friedman he had something called negative income tax. The earned income tax credit is in many ways kind of like a universal basic income, except for that you have to work to get the earned income tax credit. But there are going to be pros and cons of that as well, right? So I think the universal basic income, if you replaced this system with a universal basic income, you would avoid having these cliffs where people are disincentivized to work. You might create some other problems, though, because there could be another type of disincentive to work, which is, why should I work if I can just collect this universal basic income? So that's called what economists call the income effect. The income effect meaning that if it's just kind of unconditional, I'm going to receive this income whether I work or not, then maybe UBI isn't going to be the solution to to all problems. But I think most economists of the sort of Milton Friedman school would tell you that if you could replace these types of programs, or many of these programs, with a basic income or some kind of basic benefit that did not have these phase-out problems, that you would probably improve incentives for people to work their way out of poverty, improve incentives to build human capital, and so on. Although these universal basic income programs are not without their challenges. All right. Next, provision of public services, or the market failure idea. So this is the basis for a vast amount of government intervention in the economy. Classic example is public goods, national defense. Nobody's saying that the government, whether it's Israel or the United States, should just sort of not do national defense because the private sector can do it. There are obvious problems with doing that because national defense is a pure public good. It's non-rivalrous, so and it's not excludable. So you basically, once one person provides it, you can't exclude another person from enjoying it. So the biggest problem. And so more generally, the idea is that goods and services that have externalities associated with them might be under-provided. So in the defense example, right, once again, somebody's just thinking, okay, I'm gonna do private provision of defense. They can provide specific security for somebody, but they're not going to be able to provide a type of national defense and still be able to get paid for it, because if I provide that defense to one group of people, it's going to be provided to others, and I won't have any way of getting compensated for paying it. So that's kind of the most obvious example of where you just sort of need government to be doing this. Now, how national defense is done is another very big question, right? I mean, in the U.S., for example, we have a lot of government contractors, a lot of defense contracting that goes on. A lot of that contracting is not done necessarily in the most competitive of ways. So the question is whether the government is actually getting efficient national defense. But other areas that this argument spills over into are healthcare, education, transportation infrastructure, and this is a pretty vast area. So I'm not going to give a kind of yes or no answer to any of these things. But I guess what I do want to highlight is that the government can generally take two approaches. One is a pure public model where you have direct provision. So in the healthcare example, right, that would be that's like the UK National Health Service, where government is basically, they have government hospitals, government doctors. Government is directly providing the health insurance. Or education, United States public education, provided by local governments. They build the school buildings by taxing people or borrowing money to do it. They hire the teachers. That's direct provision. Mixed model is with reimbursement or vouchers. And my understanding, based on Danielle's answer to the healthcare question, was that that's more of what Israel is actually doing in its healthcare system, where you basically are doing some type of reimbursement or allowing individuals to spend vouchers in certain places or for certain activities. So you say, here's a voucher for healthcare. In education, and in the U.S., there are a number of local governments that have experimented with and are increasingly adopting something called school choice, where parents don't just send their kids to like the local public school. They receive a voucher that they can use at different schools or different educational programs. So you could think of education, health, and infrastructure all as having a public model possibility, a mixed model possibility, or a pure private market possibility. And basically with this, what I just hope to do is sort of open up your thinking to the idea that a lot of these things can be things you might arrive assuming must be done by government, could actually be done with private models. And mixed models can be good or can be bad, because mixed models, you can end up with things that are say, efficient voucher type systems, or you can end up with systems that are like the aspects of the U.S. health system that I criticize, which is incredibly expensive because the government is just reimbursing whatever private actors want to do. So I mentioned some of these. Infrastructure is a good one. The public model is okay. Well, the state or the country, they are going to build the highways and streets. They're going to build the sewer and water. Mixed models would be you have freight railways or pipelines that are heavily regulated. Private model, you have rail projects, and I think a lot of it depends on how competent and efficient the government is in organizing the building and provision of this infrastructure. Nice contrast I'll give for you from the U.S. Maybe you can think of some of the parts of this lecture as being things about the U.S. that you want to make sure Israel avoids doing. Because a lot of stuff that we do is not that great. California high-speed rail. Okay, anybody heard about California high-speed rail? So there isn't a California high-speed rail, but there's been one that's been planned for a very long time. In 2008, it was announced at a cost of $33 billion, and it was estimated that it was going to be completed in 2020, and it was going to run from San Francisco to Los Angeles, and cover other parts of the state too, Sacramento, other places. As of today, that cost estimate has increased somewhat from $33 billion to $135 billion. That's a pretty big cost. Same project, right? We haven't actually completed any segments of the rail yet. And now $135 billion, just so you know, that's more than the country of Israel spends, the government of Israel spends in a year. Okay, so that's a lot of money before the war. Now more. Okay, so that's a lot of money for a train. And $15 billion has actually been spent already. What's going on? Okay, the project has gotten mired in a whole variety of problems that I think you could sort of describe. Some of them as being corruption, some of them as being maybe legitimate issues with property rights around where you can run tracks and things like that. People often say, well, China is great at building high-speed trains. Oh, they are, but that's because they just expropriate every piece of property that they need without giving any thought to anything else in there, right? So this has gotten hung up on a lot of things, also things like environmental reviews, which can be important but can also be excessive. So anyway, contrast that. It's not that we can't build infrastructure in the U.S., just that we're often very bad at doing it with purely a pure public model. Here's a mostly private model called Brightline. Okay, so Florida actually has a new train system. Some people would say, yeah, well, it's not really high-speed rail. It only goes at about 120 miles per hour. Okay, it's true. It's not, for rail purists, it's not as fast. But this was launched in 2018. This was built during the same time period that the California high-speed rail was supposed to be built. And now you can take trains all over Florida, privately financed with some tax-advantaged bonds. So that was one of the keys, was unlocking some tax-advantaged bonds to make it advantageous for the private company to do it. But they've got hundreds of thousands of riders every month, and now they've been hired to do a new project in Las Vegas that's supposed to actually go into California and do some of the stuff that the California high-speed rail was going to do, but couldn't do. So bottom line, there are different models. You shouldn't always assume necessarily that the public model is going to be public provision is going to be optimal, or is going to be the fastest, or the best, or the most efficient. Often you have mixed models for things where you might have thought, oh, the government has to do that. Yeah.
Because if so, there's not going to be a need for two trains doing the same way. It's going to be a market failure. So is it going to be private forever, or after I don't know how much time it's going to be a federal company?
So you're concerned about being a monopoly?
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, it is going to be a monopoly because public rails, rail service. I mean, I think one of the things that happened for this to go through was that there had to be what's called a concession. The government had to give this company the right to run this train. So that is true, and other countries have tried to deal with this by saying, trying to, Great Britain, deregulated the trains, privatized their public system. So there were some ways of dealing with that, like saying, okay, they have to open it up to some competition, like they have to let some other company use their tracks and things like that. So I think that's exactly right. One does worry about, monopoly provision when you have
private infrastructure, and maybe that's where you know that's where there's a lot of debate about, okay, what's a natural monopoly? To what extent should the government think about regulating natural monopolies to help protect consumers? Yeah.
What do you think about the U.S. prison system?
Oh my gosh. So you're asking me, do I think that the U.S. prison system is too much in private hands? Yeah, I have not studied the system enough to like say something really intelligent about it. I guess what I would think would be that, well, one thing I see about things vary state by state a lot as well, and I would say that in general, what I suspect is happening is that it is there is private provision of prison services in the United States, but it's very, very concentrated, and there's not competition. And so without knowing a whole lot about the sector, what I would suspect would be that a lot of the problems that you might read about, I mean, that I've read about in private provision of prison services have to do with the fact that there's not true competition going on. As is the case with a lot of national defense contracting and things like that. If you have true competition and competition on both price and kind of quality of services, that you get better outcomes. But in principle, I don't see any reason, I have no principled reason why you couldn't have private provision of prison services as long as the government is clearly specifying, okay, you know, what are the services and what are the requirements that we have for things like, for safety and so on in the prisons. So also under the category of market failures is industrial policy and subsidies to private enterprise. So some potentially valid uses include national security, although as Bob told me at breakfast today, he said that when he was in DC and traveling in the sphere of lobbyists, that national security was the excuse that everybody tried to use for all types of industrial policy. So it is potentially valid to say that there are some critical technologies, like in the defense sector, where you really need those technologies to remain domestic, right? So I think, in the United States, you don't want, there is a problem if what we currently have is almost all of our 95% of our rare earth, refined rare earths, which are necessary for all manner of processes, just are provided by China. And that seems to be like that poses some dangers. On the other hand, you can overuse that argument pretty dramatically and end up with a lack of competition and higher costs. And even the valid uses are often stretched to subsidize firms that are politically connected. So right now, a lot of the debate in the U.S. is, what about semiconductors? You know, is it okay that we're relying so much on potentially adversarial nations for essential inputs like semiconductors, such as China? Or how about nations like Taiwan, which are not adversarial but are threatened by our adversaries? Should we be subsidizing semiconductors in the U.S. being produced in the U.S. As you know, in order to try to get ahead of those problems? So I guess the bottom line of that is there are potentially valid reasons there, but those reasons are often stretched, particularly by politically connected companies who want to be able to say, well, we want to make money, we want the government to subsidize us here, so we're going to say this has a major national security implication when maybe it doesn't.
We see the result of it with Intel.
Yeah.
There is a company that was a very successful, innovative company, made some mistakes, and then suddenly they're in Washington. This is national security.
Right.
And then they're getting subsidized, and then they're just worse off. They were including getting major subsidies from Israel.
Yeah, so Intel, what's just for everybody's follow, but Intel, the U.S. government has just taken a 10% equity stake in Intel, which is somebody who was just talking to you on the Venezuela slide about all of the problems with nationalizing companies in Venezuela is kind of horrifying and in many ways, or very, very, very worrisome, because you end up with the subsidization of uncompetitive firms, and big problem.
I can promise you, we talked last night about AI, and I can promise you that all the AI lobbyists are all over Washington State today, saying the government needs to get involved in national security.
Yeah, 100%. Okay, so last one I was going to go over was smoothing over shocks. So fiscal policy, the government can tax and spend, borrow to stimulate demand in the economy, monetary policy. I guess the point I'll make about this, it's not running out of time, is just we've really seen a ratcheting up of the level of government involvement in the economy, government spending as a share of the economy in each crisis where the government said we're just coming in to stabilize things. That's the main point I want to make. So how important is that stabilization if we see this ratcheting up? And sort of to end, I'm going to skip over a few things here that I don't have time for. But you know, what you have seen is with the COVID crisis, unintended economic consequences, spike in debt, inflation, higher interest rates. You saw the federal government bailing out states and cities. I like this graph from Kevin Williamson, the National Review. He said, the coronavirus will be the Leviathan's enabler. I love that phrase. Because actually the coronavirus, COVID sort of what became a justification for massive increases in government spending that led to spikes in government debt, inflation, higher interest rates, and the Fed's bond buying also bailed out many investors. You know, what's bizarre with COVID is that, you know, you would think that if in a functioning capitalist economy, you have people who buy stocks. If COVID comes, if you buy stocks in a functioning capitalist economy and COVID comes along and damages the economy, you're going to lose some money. But that was not the approach that the federal government took. The federal government took the approach, not only are we going to try to protect everybody by shutting everything down, which is counterproductive, but we're going to make everybody whole. By bailing everybody out, right, we're going to provide a protection program for businesses. We're going to have the Federal Reserve buying stocks, buying government bonds, buying state and local bonds. So it seemed like there were a lot of unintended economic consequences of that. And one of those was the following, which I'm just going to skip a few slides here. I'll talk about that. I'll end with one more poll and some results about what some of the consequences were of the COVID spending. So one of the problems that we've seen is that the debt goes up, right? The debt goes up in those graphs. Interest payments also go up a lot. So the government is spending a lot more on interest than it ever has before. Spending a lot more on interest than it ever has before in the United States. And if you think back to when I compared the U.S. to Israel, there was this category, general public services. All right, included in general public services are interest payments on the national debt. So here is a poll question for you, which hopefully is activated. What level of interest payments as a share of government revenue is too much? So I want you to think about the following. You're a taxpayer, and every dollar of your taxes is going to the government. A certain number of cents of that is going directly out the door to pay interest on the national debt. So just as a taxpayer, again, this isn't a factual question. I just want to know, what would make you uncomfortable as a taxpayer? You'd say, well, boy, my country is really actually on the wrong path here. When would you say my country is on the wrong path? If you thought that 50% or more of your tax money was going out the door to pay interest, would you say your country is on the wrong path? I mean, that's pretty bad, right? If half of every dollar is going out there. But I just want you to answer what's sort of the maximum amount that you would tolerate, all right? So what's the maximum amount where you would say is okay? So that's how I want you to answer the question, right? Would you be okay with 50% or more? If so, check that. Would you be okay with 33%, but not with 50% or more? Then check that. Would you be okay with 25%, but not more than 25%? Or, if you I would really be only okay with 1% of every dollar of my taxes going to pay interest. What would make you, that would be saying I really don't want there to be any money going out the door to pay interest on the government debt. What level of interest payments as a share of government revenue is too much for you? So we'll answer that. So 15 of you have answered. Let's see if we can get up to a 25 response rate. All right, just a few more. Feel free to answer. What level of interest payments is the maximum you'd be comfortable with of these numbers? That's what we're going for. Okay. All right, I'm gonna shut it down. So just choose a number. Maybe I should vote. The thing is, I know what the answer. I know what the actual number is. That's the just like with my opening poll. I also knew what that actual number was as well. Okay, I'm going to lock it. So just answer if you want to answer. If not, okay, great. All right, so let's see. Okay, so interesting. All right, so nobody was really okay with 33% or more. 30, you were okay with a quarter of your tax money going to pay interest on the national debt. Modal answer, 10%. Okay, so 48, about half of you were okay with about 10% of interest payments as a share of government revenue going out the door. 22% were okay with 5%. So let me show you what it is in the US. And I know in Israel it's much lower. So this is a graph that shows interest payments to share revenue. And the darker line here would, I guess, be the headline number, which is around 18% is the headline number. All right, so that's where the U.S. So in the United States of America, 18 cents of every dollar as of 2025 was going out the door to pay interest. And if you exclude the Social Security revenues from that, because Social Security is our old age pension program that, as we were talking about before, is supposed to be thought of as being kind of separate, that's 25 cents of every dollar. And then what we have here are projections going forward based on, I guess the darker lines are just very mild economic assumptions. So the U.S. government does projections out pretty much assuming that that interest rates stay where they are, right? So that right now, interest rates and the interest payments in the federal debt are getting about a 3.5% interest rate. So if you assume that 3.5% interest rate is going to continue, then we're pretty much on an upward trajectory going up to a quarter. 30%. It's rising very, very uncomfortably, very fast. If interest rates rise any more, one set of it's kind of stress tests I've done is look at what happens if interest rates just rise by 1 percentage point per decade over the next decade. And here you end up with interest costs massively spiraling out of control. It's not
Rates in the United States percentage is higher than defense spending.
higher than
Defense spending.
interest payments in the United States are higher than defense spending, and that was my little tease on general government purposes in the bar charts at the beginning with the U.S. versus Israel. U.S. is spending more on interest payments than they are on the military, on defense. I guess you could look at this graph and say is there any? Yeah, sure, yeah.
Do you know on which model the graph itself used to project the next step for its fortification?
Yeah, to project the next. What are you most interested in? So for interest rates, they're projecting the solid line here is just the interest rates just stay flat. For the economy as a whole, it's the Congressional Budget Office. And what I've done in this graph is I've taken the Congressional Budget Office, which are the solid lines. The Congressional Budget Office, which the U.S. government agency publishes, the solid blue line and this solid blue line here. And I just did a little tiny stress test. Let's say interest rates just go up by 1 percentage point in the next decade. So the bright side, the way to look at this is, well, we had sort of experienced something like this before. In the late 80s and early 90s, you had similar levels of interest eating up government revenues. But that was a time when interest rates were very, very high. That's the first thing, because the Fed had raised interest rates very, very high. You had rates in the federal debt of 10% at the beginning of that decade. And also, we were able to do very, very significant spending cuts during the 1990s, particularly because our defense situation improved dramatically because the Cold War ended. So we were able to cut spending a lot. So the bottom line of this is that we're at a point now where the size of government in the U.S. has basically threatened our ability to be able to respond to any types of emergencies, true emergencies that might occur, including military emergencies. I mean, not good if we're spending more on interest than we are on the military. And our spending on the military, this is supposedly for the United States. I don't want to call it a peacetime, but because there are wars being fought around the world, but it is more or less. It's not a time when the U.S. homeland is currently being threatened. It's not like a situation like what Israel faces. So I think this shows you that we've gotten to a point where we have to really think about what exactly the optimal size of government is, what we're spending money on. This makes us very non-resilient. It makes us very exposed to risks or other risk factors, particularly national security risk factors that might come up. Just briefly, right? What you told me what areas or what levels would be too much for you, right? 10% you might be okay with. Some were okay with 25%. Around the world, there are many examples of sovereign debt crises where the interest rates spike up, the government basically can't do anything. What are some levels where there's been concern? Well, so the UK and Italy in 2023, they were at below 10%. Again, the United States is at 18%, right? So that's where the UK and Italy were. You look at some of these these are all these sovereign crises, and the y-axis is the interest over general government revenues, and then these are the years, based as the years relative to the crises. So, it got really bad, right? Mexico in 1982, they had 90% of the revenues were going to interest. But you've heard of some of these other crises, Lebanon in 2020, Russia, Portugal, and so on. So here's where the U.S. is right now. It's around, it's above where the UK was in 1976 when the IMF had to bail out the United Kingdom. A lot of people don't remember that, but it happened. But it's around these areas where Peru, Portugal, Russia experienced fiscal crises. Here's the projected range for the 2030s, and then here's the range for the 2050s. So definitely levels of government interest payments that are consistent with the sovereign debt crisis, and we're not even really experiencing any type of national emergency right now. So, okay, conclusion. Well, I believe the government plays an important role in enforcing property rights and the rule of law. Government plays an important role in creating a public safety net, and it also provides an important role in providing public services when there are market failures. I don't think, I consider myself very squarely in the kind of free market economics category, and I'm not going to tell you that there's not a role of government in those areas. I think there is a role of government in those areas. I think we have to think about some of the challenges of social safety nets and the disincentives they provide to people to work. I think we have to think about the question of efficient provision of public services and whether there are true market failures or whether the private sector might be able to provide things more efficiently than the government. Government also does a lot of redistribution of income across people and across time, and that's going to be the topic of my talk on Wednesday. The redistribution across people. Redistribution across time, well, basically, they have done a lot of redistribution across time in the United States from past or current generations to future generations that are going to have to deal with these interest payments and deal with the debt. Optimal size and scope of government is a public choice question. I think the key is you've got to really worry about the unintended consequences of government policy that can lead to reduced prosperity and load costs onto future generations. Thank goodness, I'll just say my reading of the evidence about Israel is just, thank goodness that Israel has put itself in a relatively sound fiscal position to be able to deal financially with the national security challenges that it faces and that periodically faces. Fortunately, while you may criticize your government officials on all manner of grounds, on net, fortunately, the fiscal position of Israel has been good enough to be able to handle and manage the national security crisis. And I think going forward, there'll be a lot of questions about how should Israel emerge from the war in terms of in terms of economic policy, and hopefully some of these thoughts will help guide that. So, that's it.